Speaking of last week and this week going together, moral arguments and design arguments, Immanuel Kant, who is one of the great villains, in my opinion, of modern thought, right there with David Hume, nevertheless made an interesting statement one time that can seem as though he's favoring these latter two kinds of arguments. He said, "There's two things that fill me with ever-increasing awe and wonder: the starry skies above me and the moral law within me." And no surprise, he thought that those elements of reality were the closest thing you can get to an argument for the existence of God. But he didn't really mean the exact same things that we're going to mean. For him, it was a little bit more of a subjective sense. But the argument from design, just like last week, the argument from objective right and wrong is an objective appeal. We're appealing to some just like we appealed to a real right and wrong. Yes, it was inside of us, but that wasn't the heart of the argument. It evidences something that is outside of us. Well, even more so, we're going to see that we're not talking about something that nature inspires me. The design of something inspires me, which it does, but the argument is much stronger than that. The idea is that you have real objects in motion that exhibit all of the qualities of being produced by an ultimate mind. Or else, in the other form of the argument, the older form, we see things that are formed with an objective tendency to be something or to do something. And why? Because they have a particular nature. It requires them to be that thing and not other things. And there has to be a sufficient reason or cause that intends those tendencies or informs those forms. When I say it like that, that's one of my clue ways to say that the two kinds of arguments for me, they're not against each other. There are thinkers that try to say that they're so radically different, Thomas Aquinas' version versus the form that now we know as intelligent design in the modern scientific debate. But they're not really that different at the end of the day. They're different in terms of method and the language that they use. Much like the cosmological argument, modern evidentialist types are going to reason in a different way than the classical argument. But again, I'm going to suggest that there's a common ground, there's a common thread that runs through both arguments. So just like we've been doing, we'll look at the different kinds of argument, and then if we get to it, I always shortchange this part, but again, it is just an introductory class. So let's get right to it. First with a quote. When we look at this, in a sense, if you look at it, as a picture, if I could draw a picture that represents both, this is going to look like the easier way to understand. In fact, if you read Thomas's Fifth Way, it's a paragraph, basically. If you start to get into this, it'll look easy at first too when you look at the watch, but then when you start to take apart the watch and you start getting into scientific, or the cell, this looks a lot harder. But actually, this is a lot harder to understand, and this is a lot easier to understand. So there'll be a little bit of deceptiveness there. So in order to get our minds wrapped around this, we need some grammar. And one of the better Thomistic thinkers today, Edward Feser, gives us some help. In order to understand some of what Thomas is saying, you have to do a little Aristotle 101, and we've done some of that. We've learned words like act and potency, and we're going to need to bring them back today. Any particular thing that's in motion in this world has a potential nature, a thing that it is. It can only become certain things. It can't become anything. Cat DNA is not going to one day jump up and become a bird, contrary to what some evolutionists think. I know you think that's an oversimplification of their view, but actually it's not. And it's for this reason. It's an actualization of something is really bound to what Genesis 1 calls kinds. There's boundaries because everything has a particular nature. So Aristotle's way of saying that is just potency and act. Okay, well here's what Feser says about this idea of goal-directedness. He says, for Aristotelians, our conscious thought processes are only a special case of the more general phenomenon of goal-directedness or final causality. So another thing we learned from Aristotle 101 was the different kinds of causes. Efficient cause being the first cause, the actor, and you have the material and formal cause, You've got the stuff that makes it a particular thing, that's the material cause. And you have the form, the idea, the thing itself, and that's the formal cause. But then you have this final cause or end cause, which is the reason that the actor acted. He's producing something or doing something. That's final causality. It's goal-directedness, which exists in the natural world in a way that is mostly divorced from any conscious mind or intelligence. And he doesn't mean finally divorced. He means when you look at it, you don't see these things thinking about where they're going. They're just moving in a certain direction. So he says to intend an end, in the sense Aquinas has in mind, in this fifth way, is not necessarily to make a conscious decision to pursue some goal, but rather just to have a natural inclination towards something. So in other words, he's setting you up to realize that if you deny this, you're denying that things have a natural inclination towards something, which is why a lot of naturalistic scientists reject a view called scientific realism. They actually have to reject that things are actually there, which is really inconvenient if you're going to base your whole worldview on the fact that you can see in a superior way how things that are there behave in a way that somehow excludes God. Now, that's a lot of convoluted stuff, but at this point, all he's saying is, when I say goal-directedness, all I mean is that everything that moves has a particular, fixed, objective, natural way that it inclines toward the direction that it goes. Two extreme errors about that. The first is to assume, as we already did, that all those old thinkers, did they actually believe that everything had a mind and it was moving toward an end? Must fall, the rock, must fall, must fall. Well, that's goofy. Although some people have tried to, on a pop level, if they want to make fun of the people back then, they want to come up with a straw man like that. Well, if you're a respectable scholar, you can't really get away with that. So the second is to assume that, okay, what the older thinkers were saying is that, okay, since that has to be, since most efficient causes in this world do not have minds, well, then there must be two kinds of things. Those that are tending towards some end that are driven by intelligence. I have a dart there, but I also have it going. That's a mixed metaphor. Don't worry about it too much. But Aquinas does use the example of an archer and his arrow. Clearly, we can at least see, every atheist would agree, that the archer is an intelligent being, and he's directing the arrow. The arrow's flight pattern is a result of intelligent design. So there's that kind of a thing. But then the majority of things that move in this world are perfectly natural things, where clearly there is no intender or designer. Well, such a simplistic division was imposed by modern thinkers on ancient and medieval thinkers, and they've made that the object of their attack. And so that idea of a final cause was banished from scientific inquiry. And like I said before, when you do that, you arrive at this absurd mindset of denying that things have objective natures. Okay? So what I have here is the idea that everything moving in this world, which is how many things again? Everything, because, get out the microscope, or even at theoretical atomic level, everything is in motion. So everything is what it is. Remember that law of identity? A equals A, and not something else. If you reject that, which is the more you start to peel under the onion, you realize, oh, this is actually more complex than I've been led to believe about what ancient and medieval people used to think. And so each thing tends toward a particular end, not because it has a mind, that goofy idea, but because that natural tendency in each thing is a thing with a nature. It's not some other nature, certainly not a contradictory nature. It is what it is. So one of the examples Fazer uses when he's arguing against David Hume, because remember, David Hume wanted to attack the idea that we can know a particular cause to any particular effect. And so Fazer uses the example of a rock being thrown at a window, that a rock traveling in that direction 99 times out of 100 is not going to be the rock, and then the 100th time, suddenly, for no reason at all, turn into a bouquet of flowers. But on Hume's account, you can't really, not that Hume was saying that he was holding out hope for that, he's just saying that you can't give any account for why that is the case. Okay, so that's the first building block that we're putting into place now is that everything has a natural tendency. So what are we talking about when we say that something is tending towards something or forming towards something? Because again, don't just have in mind the arrow or the rock. Have in mind atoms, molecules, chemical reactions, a water molecule forming into something else. Everything is doing this all the time in this world. Okay, so how does that apply to everything that moves? How does this function in Aquinas' argument? Well, simply stated, the natural tendency of every single thing is the perfection of the thing in virtue of what it is. So that's what I mean by an intrinsic principle. It's not simply that it's being moved by something else in a certain direction, and that's why it hits the bullseye, or that's why it forms into a water molecule instead of another. No, the actual nature of the thing, all things being equal, can't become something else or go in some other direction. It goes in the direction that it actually is. So a couple weeks ago, when we looked at some of these things with the cosmological argument, I used a soccer ball because I figure it's an easy enough example, being kicked, and there the emphasis was on the foot this way. The emphasis was on there not being an infinite regress this way. A simplistic way to look at this, it's actually not that simplistic, is that now we're just taking that and we're going that way. Well, that's part of what we're doing, but that really only works with intelligent actors. Here we're talking about something that's deeper. And so he uses the example of a ball, and he doesn't use a soccer ball, but he uses a ball being bouncy roundness, that's what he uses, not bounciness. So the question is, what does this roundness come from, and how does it fulfill its end? And in the medieval scholastic world, there were debates about this. This won't be on the test. You want to know who the teams are here, but just so you know, they're Scotists and Swarensians. They are named after particular guys in the medieval world, whereas Aquinas, you know him, the Thomists, this is another group. And these guys were saying, well, the reason why everything takes the shape that it does and goes in a certain direction that it does, all you need in order to explain that is the efficient cause. And what's the efficient cause here of the ball? Well, it's Wilson Sporting Goods. It's the people that make the ball on the assembly line. Just like when we were doing the other question, the foot was the efficient cause of the soccer kick in that argument. And here we're just going into the factory and we're getting into a little bit deeper of a question. Okay, so they're saying that all you need here, the limit of a thing's actuality, the perfection of it, that can be accounted simply by the efficient cause, the thing that brings it about. But Aquinas and Thomists were saying, well, actually, there's something else involved here, because this is conforming to a certain thing, and that's what makes it what it is, going toward that particular end. I'm trying to edit on the fly, like what things go too deeply here. That's really all you need to know to follow this part of the argument. I'll use the other language when I come to the intelligent design argument because it's better there. But let's look at his argument just in brief, actually as it's written, and then I'll summarize it. I would say of the five that Aquinas uses, this is the one that has most famously gotten a wedge driven in there and had objections that are more difficult to answer. But they can be answered, and they have been answered. Here's what he says. The fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end. Now stop right there. Again, what did you hear there? Did you hear, is he saying that when you look at bodies in motion, they're consciously acting? That's not what he says. That's why I had to do that stuff at first. It's just a little grammar. That's not what acting toward an end means. That's not all that it means. That's one aspect of it. He says, and this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way so as to obtain the best result. Sorry. Suppose I'm an evolutionist and I say, but they don't always act according. There's problems in design. Look at the sea lion. He's a mess. The eye is backwards. There's all sorts of examples, objections that you bring in against design at that point. Or what about that ball? Sometimes the ball does not conform to this perfect roundness you're talking about, and it deflates, and it doesn't achieve that end. Okay, so we can talk about that at the end too. Even that objection bears witness to the fact that there is a perfect versus an imperfect, but we'll come back to it. Hence, it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly, do they achieve their end. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Now, if you say, this is an obvious objection, well, that only works if the entire world is made up of archers and arrows. The whole problem there, the atheist says, we'll bring this back, is that it's a false analogy, or it's what we call a part-to-whole fallacy. A part-to-whole fallacy is this. I have a picture later. We'll come back to it. But you attribute to the whole what's true of a part. So you're making a hasty generalization. If it's true about this, then it's true about all things in that class. Well, that would be true if all things were like the arrow being shot by the archer. So you can see where they're going to attack there. He's saying, look at the world. Natural bodies work towards some goal, not by chance. And by chance, all he means is not according to whatever. They have particular natures. That's all he means. Most natural things lack knowledge. In other words, Aquinas is saying, I know that most natural things do lack knowledge, but that's not what I meant by goal-directedness. But this is the most vulnerable part. But as an arrow reaches its target because it's directed by an archer, what lacks intelligence achieves its goals by being directed by something intelligent. And that's where they're going to say that's a part-to-whole fallacy, or it's a false analogy. And that's been made in famous cases like David Hume, and it's been made as just common as you're reading it. That's maybe something that's popping up in your mind. But he's got to prove that. Right. Yes. He's got to prove that particular premise. Now, because that involves so much thinking through the analogies, it is best to go to this, which involves much more information and study, but still is simpler, because you're covering that ground of why it's not a false analogy. And that's why I say I wouldn't separate these two arguments. I would actually try to understand the first one by means of this. I think you can do that if it's presented in a correct way. This is going to give us some grammar and some of a head start to the weeks we do on science. So this is going to perform a dual function here when we talk about. This is actually the cover of William Paley's Natural Theology, the last couple of versions of it that have come out, which has made me think about what Oxford publishers have in mind by having a skeleton in a praying position. There's sort of a subtle psychological suggestion. Yes, Oxford publishers, I know what you're up to. It's not hard. Subtle suggestion that this is some kind of a relic of the past, but it's dead now. We get it. I think there's a subtle suggestion going on there. But yeah, that's kind of what they've chosen as their cover. What I have here is some systems of the human body being abstracted, and then the parts of an old-fashioned watch being abstracted, because we're going to see the analogy that I was referring to, and this comes from William Paley. He wrote a book in 1802. It was called Natural Theology, and of course, pay attention to that date. That's a generation before what and who? Charles Darwin, writing The Origin of Species. And Darwin was very familiar with William Paley. To be a thinking person in the British world at that time, you were familiar with William Paley, and in fact, a whole movement called British Natural Theology, which was very evidential in nature, but they had good things to say. And in this book, right at the beginning, he brings us to this famous analogy, which Richard Dawkins wrote a book in 1986 that kind of put him on the map called The Blind Watchmaker. And it was obviously a play on this. What he was saying, well, actually that watch can be accounted for by a blind, in other words, not a personal constructor of the parts and so on. So here's what Paley said. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place, I should hardly think of the answer which I had given or before given. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? In other words, why would it be absurd to answer the same way I did about the stone? Well, I just been there forever, for all I know, or just got there, just by chance. Why wouldn't I be able to say that about the watch? For this reason, and for no other, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. For example, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the several parts had been differently shaped than what they are, of a different size than what they are, or places after any other manner, or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it. Now, if you're familiar, by the way, with contemporary intelligent design literature, you might recognize embedded, suggested in that argument, two principles that we're going to look at, one called irreducible complexity and one called specified complexity. And in this case, it's the complexity of the pieces that make up this organized system. So think of both a mechanized system, like the watch, and a living system, a biological organism, each as systems. And I'm going to use that language. And so without using those phrases, Paley is suggesting that there are those two principles. So just hold that under your hat. I'll explain the principles in just a bit. But for now, let's simplify the argument. Because he's not just giving us a story and saying, come on, isn't that neat? And that couldn't have, like the Boeing 747, that analogy and others, that if you just in a scrapyard, that it could just have, by design, for a certain amount of time, or if a tornado hit, I forget how the analogy goes, that it would have arranged itself as a Boeing 747. That logic is similar here, but he's doing something a little bit more orderly, and he's doing this, just to make it as simple as possible, too simple actually, and this is where the skeptic is going to drive a wedge in, but let's start with this. Premise one, in the universe we see design. The older word that was used sometimes was contrivance. Contrivance. Somebody did something here. That's all. To achieve something. That's all that has to mean at this point. Second premise, design implies a designer, an intelligence. And we'll have to obviously define these words because they'll say, well, no, it doesn't. So we'll have to have a criteria for what we mean by an intelligence or a design or contrivance or whatever. And then he makes the leap. It's not a leap at all, but if you leave it at this, it looks like a leap. The universe as a whole evidences design. Here's why it's not a leap. He's not making this follow this. Notice the word therefore, just a little logic 101 time. The word therefore is not in premise 3. It's a premise. It's not a conclusion. Paley's not saying, because watch, because I infer this when I see a watch, therefore, he hasn't got that far yet. All he's saying is, he's making these parallels, analogies. He's saying, just like that. Now he's going to have to defend that. But that's not a conclusion. That's just a parallel premise. Okay? The universe as a whole, in other words, is like that. He'll show you that. Now he gets a conclusion. Therefore, this design in the universe as a whole implies an intelligent designer. So 1 and 2 is going to be parallel or analogous to 3 and 4. The contrivance I see in the universe has to be like, in some way, the contrivance I see in a watch. Okay? Now, obviously, the problem here is that when you make it this simple to introduce it, which is a good thing, you can't stop there because then you leave it vulnerable to that very charge of being either a false analogy or a part-to-whole fallacy. So that third premise, of course, is where you're going to need to do all your work. And that's where contemporary intelligent design science fills that in and explains and justifies that premise. Now, contrary to popular belief, Paley doesn't stop. By the way, everything I quote from Paley today will be the first 20 pages of a book that's hundreds and hundreds more. So contrary to popular belief, Paley doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop at the watch. He moves on, he expands the same analogy to consider a second watch that you found. And what if you discovered that the second watch was actually made by the first watch? What's he doing? He's anticipating. He knows. He's not a knucklehead. Well, he was a guy that lived a long time ago, and then Charles Darwin came along and straightened us all out. No, Charles Darwin read this and didn't know what to do with it. He knew that one of the obvious first objections is, that's just a God of the gap. They'd been hearing that already in the modern world. And so, why appeal to a finite, universal intellect designer when this thing could be explained naturally by coming from something just like it or sufficiently like it before it? Well, what if? He's already on to you. Is the necessity for an organization principle any different if there were an infinite series of such reproductive principles? In other words, what if there were an infinite series of these watches producing other watches? You still would not have accounted for what contrivance is, and ultimately what we're going to get to, what this irreducible complexity is. So in fact, Paley answers 8 different objections in these early pages, and they're all the objections you hear down to the present day in one form or another, and what he's going to say to them each time is, you are avoiding the question. You, in fact, are not thinking through this as deeply as you should. Objection 1, I'm just going to go through these. I don't have time to answer them all. But nobody witnessed the process of design. Nobody witnessed a lot of things that go on in science or history, hence the scientific and historical method to discover things that are under the surface. Objection 2, occasional failure and constant imperfections. We'll come to that in Hume. That's actually going to shoot itself in the foot. Objection 3, many parts not yet revealing how they contribute to the function. So think of vestigial structures. We'll look at that. You got a tailbone. I know somebody else who had a tailbone. You must be the same guy. That's stupid. That's simplistic, actually. I get it at first, the similarity, but no, that's actually a false analogy. And sometimes you come to find out that things like vestigial structures, those are the things that beings have, either in their stages of development, in the embryo, or afterwards, that it looks a lot like some other species, which is a really goofy argument because there's a lot of things in different species that are a lot like other species, but you haven't really specified anything that is going to, make the meat of this argument. I don't want to get too much into science at this point, but that's part of the problem there. Objection 4, the same form might just as well function in innumerable other structures, many in fact do. What, like DNA? What, like food? What, like reproduce? Like standing up and having bones that can hold you up? That's not an argument. Objection 5, the principle of order is inherent to the structure's reproductive capacities. Let me just go through the rest of these. Objection 6, mechanism is no evidence, but only motive to think it so. I will remember to quote Dawkins and Francis Crick about this, about the appearance of design and convincing their students, everything. You have to keep in mind, my young biology students, that Everything in this universe does have the appearance of design. You've got to drive that out of your mind. They don't quite say it like that, but it's kind of how it comes across. Objection 7, some law caused it to be so. Such law is prescriptive, not merely descriptive. That's the appeal to natural law. Not the same natural law we were talking about last week. That's part of the problem with modern language. Objection 8, this is our favorite. This shows up today. This is the Anthony Fauci objection. I am the science. They didn't say it like that. You lack scientific expertise. You don't know this is too complex. One thinker, Thomas Sowell, calls that the complex complex. It's what elitists do when they don't want to have a conversation. They just want to get on with things and you're bothering them. So they say, well, you're not a scientist like I am. And I always respond the same way when somebody says, oh, good, perfect. Can you teach me? Oh, perfect, then you'll understand perfectly what I'm about to say. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, whatever, but that's not why they said it. It was a shut-up line, and they want to get out of the conversation. Well, in applying his own argument, Paley employs an analogy, again, and he uses a greater to lesser argument. He basically says, and I don't have to write this down because there's just two premises and a conclusion. If contrivance, therefore design, contrivance is observed, therefore design is established. The analogy he uses is between the eye and the telescope. And this is what bothered Darwin so much, because he struggled with the eye, the complexity of the eye. And Paley basically said, if the telescope exhibits contrivance, and nobody denies that, and notice, by the way, the telescope is the same kind of thing as an eye. It helps us see, so that's why I picked that. Then how much more complex must the mind that created the eye be than the one that created the telescope? So if you can understand the telescope and how that, and of course, the predictable charge is going to be false analogy. So Paley says, the perception arising from the image may be laid out of the question. For the production of the image, these instruments are the same kind, telescope, eye. The end is the same. The means are the same. The purpose in both is alike. The contrivance for accomplishing that purpose is in both alike. What Paley's doing there is, first of all, a false analogy is actually a technical name for a fallacy. Something is not a false analogy. You hear this all the time. Every analogy breaks down. Yes, that's not a bad thing. That's what an analogy is. It's limited. It shows something that's like another thing in the relevant point. So you can't argue against analogy by saying, well, not everything about them is the same. Yeah, I know. That's what the word like means. It doesn't mean it's identical. It means it's analogous. The question is, are they alike in the relevant properties or predicates? And Paley's saying, for the purposes of my analogy, yes, they are the same in these 4 or 5 ways. And so he goes on from there to make that case, the lesser to greater argument, that the greater the complexity in the eye argues for a greater mind. I mentioned those two terms. It's a good place to introduce them because we'll see them when we look at evolution. So if you're familiar with intelligent design arguments at all, for or against, you'll recognize these terms, irreducible complexity and specified complexity. Might as well define them at this point, because we'll use them again in the next few weeks. Irreducible complexity, the guy that came up with this was Michael Behe. He wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box in the 1990s. He's a professor, I don't know, maybe he still is, professor of biology, biochemistry at Lehigh University? Lehigh. I can't pronounce it. And I don't know if he's still in that capacity. He's written other books after that. He's not a Christian, or at least he wasn't at the time. But that book was highly controversial. There were other books in the decade before that written against evolution that I might mention in the next few weeks. But this guy in particular comes up, and I say he invented this idea. He didn't invent it. He came up with this language for it, but as I just said, it was already embedded in Paley's argument, and Darwin was dealing with it, okay, in his writings. But it's this. It's the property of a system. Remember, system can mean a machine or an organism. The property of a system by which the absence of just one part would render the system as a whole non-functional, and Behe popularized using the mousetrap as an analogy for that, or as an example of that, I guess you could say. Is it because it's simple? There's only a couple of parts to follow, that if you're missing one of them, the whole thing won't function in the way that it was designed. Obviously, you could pick it up and try to chase a mouse with it, but obviously that's going to perform as well. So that's irreducible complexity, and he applies this to the cell. He applies to proteins and cell formation, because the problem isn't just at the surface, the problem is at the biochemical level. And that's what he was trying to drive down toward, you could say. Well then, William Dembski, who wrote Intelligent Design and many other books after, but that's kind of the one that put him on the map, and he's sort of a mathematician, philosopher, and he is a Christian theist. But he came up with this idea of specified complexity. And there's other, by the way, hybrids that use an adjective and the word complexity to show different angles on this. But they are different things, because one of the things the intelligent design movement wants to do is it wants to answer the challenge of, okay, give me a criteria, scientific criteria to show how what you're doing is not just hocus pocus or God of the gaps, or you guys are just young earth creationists that are repackaging stuff and appealing to Scripture, whatever. In other words, what all that means is you're not doing science. And science aims its microscope or telescope at how nature actually observes. So show us what you're looking at in nature. Well, the central way that Dembski has attempted to answer that is with this idea of called specified complexity. And as I'll mention, whenever I mention it, is that already operates in cryptology, in the SETI program that, whatever you think of that, the government commissions to search for extraterrestrial life. In other words, what are they doing? They're decoding signs. Obviously, a lot of computer technology is dealing with this, but it's information theory. But you're also, there are sciences that have already existed that look for specified complexity, because it's not enough for a thing, in order to show design, it's not enough for a thing to be specified. There's all sort. The number 1 by itself is specified. It's not 3, it's not 2, it's not 16. But then it has to be complex. Okay, so a chain of ones, I wouldn't be. A chain, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 16, 17, 18, 19, or whatever. You pick your combination, shake up the magic 8 ball, and throw it out there on the number line. Can be complex, but it's not necessarily specified. Okay, so what are they doing? They're showing a pattern. Let me read it. I probably only have it up there, so I'll have to do this. This is the criteria by which we empirically detect design. So what do you mean by design scientifically? We mean this. Whenever a pattern displays a large amount of information that is specific, but also having a low probability of occurrence. I just have that because Dembski at one point uses an example of a target. This is way oversimplified, because you have to intend to hit your target, and I suppose you can, I guess it doesn't even matter if it's an expert shooter versus not, whether or not there's been a shooter there, or whether or not there's been somebody aiming at a particular thing, okay? So I'm doing this both to introduce these concepts for science, but also to show more of what's meant by intending and informing, okay? So let's look at the objections really quickly by way of wrapping up here. That's Dawkins, by the way. He's very confused and upset, especially about this. One of his books, The Greatest Show on Earth, I think that's the one. There's a whole chapter of him railing against what is called Platonic essentialism. You don't have to know the specifics of it, but if you know Genesis 1 and the word kinds, one of the ways that plays out in the debate about evolution is about the fixity of species. In other words, there's boundaries, there's limits. There was one evolutionist named Goldschmidt. There was an idea called the hopeful monster. And it wasn't so silly that the guy actually thought that eventually a cat will produce a bird or something like that, like right out of the womb, poof. That was one of the ways he was mocked, but that wasn't the idea. But there's no reason why that wouldn't happen. Okay, because the idea here, what Dawkins was upset about, is that this idea has plagued the Western mind, and that's what we smart evolutionists have had to do war against. This idea that's lodged in our minds of these forms, that everything follows a certain pattern, that it has a particular nature, and that nature tends to have cats producing kittens every time, and not chickens or whatever. Okay, at that point you can see that he's arguing not against these things having minds. He understands that he has to argue against things having natures, things having a fixed way that they are, that acorns, and the way Plato says it is one way, the way that Aristotle says it another, and at the end of the day they're not too different. Acorns produce trees. There's a certain nature in them. Okay? And so I said things in my own way for a while, so I lost my place in my notes. But, and that actually doesn't even matter. That was just for the nerds, that quote right there. But that's what he's objecting against. And that's what they have to object against, that things have this fixed pattern. When he does that, he's arguing against teleology. Did I define teleology? No. Oh, for goodness sakes. That's what I get for skipping in my notes. Okay, the Greek word telos, which is used in places like Romans 10:4, that Christ is the end of the law. So there's a lot of things that means. Let's use some synonyms here. Bullseye, that's one way I would say it. But the words end or design or aim or even motive, but goal probably would be better there, are... In other words, that it's driving, what Paul was saying there is that the law was driving. Isn't God through the law? Yes, but the law has a particular nature. See what I'm doing there? I'm applying Aristotle's logic to Romans 10:4 and what Paul's actually saying. He's saying that the law is made by God of such a nature that it drives you toward, and the bullseye is not just Christ, but Christ in his work. So that's telos. So we get the word teleology to talk about goal-directed things. And so when we do this, we're not saying that the thing with a nature has a mind that has to think about it, but rather that it has a fixity, it has boundaries, it has a particular way that it is, and it drives towards certain things. And our question is, what have to be the sufficient causes for that when we're applying teleology to arguments for God's existence? Okay, there was another objection. Oh yes, and this ran through both. This objection can come up against both forms of the argument. That's just a part to whole fallacy. In fact, the way Hume argued this, do I want to do that yet? What am I doing? Oh, why is my computer not working? Okay. Hume is going to say, let's try to wait on him. It's going to be very similar, though. But the idea here is that if you're going to make the leap from archers with arrows, I can see how that took an intender, a designer, but I can't see how things, physical motion, again, it's because you're infusing into this idea something which those who argue this are not saying. We're saying that it has a tendency. It has an objective way that it goes, and eventually you're going to have to come up against some kind of an intender for that tendency or some kind of an informer for that information, because that's what those things are. Okay? So it's not that you simply make... Now, Aquinas is summarizing it because, believe it or not, the Summa Theologiae, as complex as it may seem to us, is actually a beginner's book on theology. It's big because it's covering a lot of subjects, but it's actually summarized. So those 5 arguments fit onto 2 pages. They're just like paragraphs. So that's why it's that small. It's not because he's not aware that there's going to be objections against these premises, but that's for the Christian apologist to fill in and to think through. Hume does something similar. I don't know why he's wearing a shower cap, but that's just Hume. But anyway, he not only says it's a false analogy, well, this is kind of where he's part to whole fallacy, but he's going to say it's a false analogy because he's saying, look, if you're going to compare the universe to a house that needs a builder, we have experiences of houses and builders, but nobody was there for this house and its builder, so it's a false analogy. And as we'll see, not just with evolution, but with the problem of evil, you're going to have what shows up, all of that shows up in the dialogues concerning natural religion. It's a very small book, but it's got a lot of the modern arguments really embedded in it. Is not just that the universe is filled with waste, like we saw about the sea lion, or one argument against the eye, but in addition to that, you have all this evil. You have all this suffering. It's not optimal. It's not a perfect house. It's a lesser house than the houses we saw by that standard. So obviously we're going to have to analyze that separately under the problem of evil. But here he's saying it's a false analogy. Sorry for pausing, but I completely deviated from my notes to try to make it simpler, and that sometimes backfires. Yeah, so one of the ways Hume argued, this guy who's a theistic philosopher is summarizing Hume's argument. He says that in such cases as these, we can properly infer powers in the cause greater than those needed to produce the observed effect because we have independent evidence of those powers in their past exercise. So the builder and the house. We've seen builders complete half-finished buildings, and we've seen walkers with 2 feet rather than 1. But in the case of the whole cosmos, which is necessarily a unique effect, we cannot draw upon such prior experience and are not entitled to a parallel inference. This is a double-edged sword. And I'll get to talk about this more with science and with the problem of evil, but we already saw it actually. In week 6, we talked about atheism, and we talked about the basic thing that all logical arguments for atheism have to do. They have to assume certain divine attributes in order to argue against those attributes. And at the end of the day, what Hume was doing here is he was saying that design, or optimal design, would look like such and such. And my next question right away is, how do you know that if there's never been such a designer? And precisely because there can't be one, that this argues against it. We're going to see this more clearly come into view when we look at the problem of evil. You have to ask the question, what does the skeptic, what does the atheist have to know in order to make the argument that optimal design would look like this? Optimal, because he's not talking about house building. He's already said that's a false analogy, so we can't compare house building to that. Okay, let me agree with you for a second. Then, since that's out of the question, tell me more about this ultimate house building that you know about. It's never happened, but that would go differently for the sea lion, or for the eye, or for the amount of space in the universe that's just wasted. You see the problem? Hume is assuming to himself omniscience, really. He's assuming to himself an amount of knowledge he would have to have that he actually also has to deny. I'll leave it at that. That's